Hi everyone, welcome to the Android lesson Fragments Part 5 Example Continuation. We'll be using these tools and these developer docs for referencing. You have to make sure you complete this previous lesson before you do this lesson because it's a continuation of the previous lesson and you will not understand this lesson unless you look at this previous lesson Fragments Part 4 Example. So in this lesson, we are continuing the previous example and we are doing further explanations, right? Further explanation of the code written in the previous example. So in the previous example, we had two fragments. We created two pane layout, one fragment to display the titles, then the other one to display the summary of each one, right? Also, we runtime configuration, how to figure out with how to tackle with portrait and landscape modes, adding fragments at runtime. As usual, it's going to be practical demonstrations. So in the previous lesson, when you run the app on a landscape orientation, you will see that it shows both fragments hand in hand, but in a portrait, it shows only one at a time, right? And if I turn it to the landscape mode, yes, you see it shows both the fragments at the same time. Right, so let's bring it back to this portrait orientation. Right, so this is what we have done up to now, right? So let's continue from here and let's discuss technically. First, let's do a few more changes, right? So let's look at the second fragment. So what's the second fragment? Now, few things. Let's look at the second fragment. Now we got this Java file. So the second fragment is the details activity. I will explain it in a little while. So in that, okay, we are loading the details fragment. So in the details fragment, if we look here, right, let's see what is there. So you got a text view, right, and you set the text on that, right? So on the text view, let's set the font and do a few things. Now one thing important here, in the second fragment, the details fragment, it's creating the text view dynamically at runtime, right? And then setting the data. So that means this second fragment is not using that XML layout file, because nowhere in this code, anywhere in this code, it's not referring to that its corresponding XML file. So details fragment has a layout file which is fragment details. Now the fragment details, it's not used in this details fragment. The way the code has been written, it's not using the XML file to display the data. So the details fragment displays, when I click, this is the details fragment. In that it displays a text, but that text, right, that text is dynamically created new text. So it's not using the fragment details.xml. So because in this example it's not using the fragment details.xml, I'm going to delete that XML file. I don't need it. So I'll right click on the fragment details and I will say delete it, and I don't want the fragment details. So even if I deleted it, there's no effect, right? So if I run this again, if I stop and run this, it will work, right? So it's loading the app again, because if I delete, if there's error, it should not work, but it is working because it's not using that XML file. Let's see whether the title fragment is also the same. If I go to titles fragment, even from the titles fragment, which is the first fragment, it's a list fragment, it is not using its layout file, right? It's not using its layout file anywhere in this code. So which means it's not using the layout file anywhere, meaning I can delete that also. So titles fragment title, so this one, see, it was not used in the code. So because of that, I'm going to delete the fragments title.xml as well, because in this example it is not using those layout files, because the layouts are dynamically generated. So the titles fragment dynamically generates its layout same, because it's a list box. Actually it's a list, so it's already extending from the list fragment, so it can generate the list, because the titles fragment, what it does is it shows a list. See this list, so this list is coming from the list fragment, so that is why you don't need that XML. That is why I deleted it, right? So in this example, the two fragments are not using the layout XML files, but the main activity is using its layout file called fragment layout, which is this one, which in the previous example you saw in the previous lesson, we have the portrait version of it and the landscape version. Then when it's okay, when it's in the, let's say, on landscape mode in the iPad or even in the phone, in the landscape mode, right, in the landscape mode it's showing the two fragments at the same time. So it's using only one activity, right? I will explain it further. So in this situation it's using only one activity, but if you go into the portrait mode, it shows only one fragment, and when I click on it, only it shows a second fragment on a new activity. So only in that instance it's using a new activity called details activity, only for that situation. Then the details activity creates a detail fragment in line number 24, and then it displays that detail fragment, right? So the detail activity, if you look here, let's see whether the detail activity is using XML. Of course the main activity is using fragment layout, but if you look at the details activity, let's see the details activity. If you look at the code, okay, if it's in the orient landscape, it's not executing this, it stops it, because when it's in the landscape mode we have already written it in a manner that it's not coming to the details activity, right? So if it's on the landscape mode, right, it's exiting this code. If not only, right, so if it's not on the landscape mode, only it will use the detail activity on the portrait mode, so that it creates a detail fragment, and the detail fragment creates its user interface dynamically, and here it just adds it to the using the fragment transaction manager, which means even the details activity does not use the active XML layout file, which means even in this example I can delete this activity details.xml because it's not used, so even if I deleted it, if I stop this and run this once again, right, if I run it once again, it still works, right, because it's dynamically getting generated. So in this exercise it's using the XML layout files only for the titles, no, only for the main activity, right? That is just to say that, okay, if it's landscape, okay, you got a fragment and a frame layout where you dynamically can display the second fragment uh, one after the other. But if it's normal mode, you just display only the first fragment, right? So only to specify that information, it is using the fragment layout or the XML file. So only the main activity, okay, in this example only the main activity is using XML layout file. The second activity and the two fragments are not using XML layout file. Why is it? As I explained, that is because they are creating the user interface dynamically. So it's a good exercise for you to understand that as well. Okay, so I deleted those. Now so if I go to the details fragment meaning when I click on the item, it shows this is the detail fragment. So in the detail fragment I want to do a few things. Let's say I want to put a couple of colors, like a background color and a font color and a font size, right? So how do I do it? So I will go to the details fragment, then I will have to do it dynamically. So for the text view, I can set the font and set the font colors, right? Let me do it now. So let's, soon after creating the text view, let's say I want to set the color and the size. So let me do it now. So I set the for the text, I set the text size and set the color, set text color. So this is how we do it. And for the details fragment, then I override the on activity created method in our, so on activity created. Why did I override on activity created? That is because as soon as creating the view, the fragment comes to this state, on activity created state, right? So that is why I'm overriding it. In that, to set the background color, I will call the get view, so to access the view of the fragment, and then set the background color into yellow. So when I run that, so this is how you will see it, right? So second fragment, the background color is yellow and the font is blue color font, right? And the size is given. I just did some changes for the appearance, right? So that it looks a little good, right? Okay. So now let's dig into detail into the coding for you to understand what's happening here from the beginning. So there's a main activity, and to put everything together, the main activity is referred to the fragment layout. So the fragment layout, there's a normal version which is the portrait version and the landscape version of it. So look at the previous video to see how we created the landscape version. In the landscape version, okay, in the normal version we have a frame layout and just one fragment. That is why when you run the normal version you will see only one fragment. But in the landscape version we got one fragment and we got a frame layout, and we are loading the second fragment to this frame layout uh, when the app is getting loaded for the landscape mode. So that is why you see the second fragment in the site, right? So now you understand how this difference works, right? That is from the portrait and the landscape layout files. So then you have to make sure you load it properly. So for that, in the main activity, right? So from that, it's referring to this layout, so the fragment, right? So when the titles fragment is getting loaded, the titles fragment is checking, right? The titles fragment, when it's getting loaded, so the titles fragment mean the first fragment, right? This first fragment, the titles fragment meaning this first fragment, the white color fragment. So when this white color fragment is getting loaded, right, it is checking titles fragment. It is okay, it's setting the list adapter because it's a list fragment, and from the Shakespeare.titles it's getting, so Shakespeare.titles is array and the dialogues, right? So from that it's getting the titles and it's passing to the list adapter. So that is how it creates this, so this list. So the titles are title 1, title 2, title 3. So that is why we see title 1, title 2, title 3 from this line, right? And then so then from it's getting access to the its parent its activity, and it's checking whether the details is available. So details meaning this frame layout, so it's not available on the portrait mode, there's no details, it's on the landscape. So when it's getting loaded, it's dynamically checking whether that is available. So if that is not null and if that is visible, that means it's dual pane, meaning it can display the second panel parallelly, right? Don't worry about this. So if it's dual pane, so now it's making the list into single mode choice, plus it's showing the details. So show details meaning it's a user defined method, which is this one. So if it's dual pane, what it does is it creates a second fragment. That is why it's load in this yellow color fragment but not in the portrait mode. In the landscape, so how it loads is when the titles fragment is getting loaded, it's checking with its dual pane. I explain it to you now. If it's dual pane, then it creates a details fragment, which is the second fragment, the yellow color fragment. And then how it creates is it's through the activity, through the get support fragment manager. Then it refers to this details, right? It refers to the details, right? So once again, let's look at this r.id.details in little detail, right? So if you look at this r.id.details, right? So it is defined as a frame layout so that you can embed fragments at runtime into this, right? You can embed fragments at runtime. So it's referring to that, right? It's referring to that, and then it's reading that, and then it gets it into the detail fragment, right? Let's look into that little more detail. So once it accesses that, right, once it finds it, it gets a reference. But if it's null, that means if that details fragment is not available, so that if it's null, right, then it creates a new instance of the details fragment. So that is how it creates it, right? So if, because at the first time there's no details fragment here. If you look here carefully, there's no details fragment here. So that is why it's checking whether it's null. It's empty. It's an empty frame layout. So there's no details fragment for sure. That's why it's checking it's null. So if it's null, it creates a new instance of the details fragment, right? So in the details fragment, there's a method where it creates a new instance. See, it gives a new instance of the fragment, right? Awesome. And then once it creates a new instance, once again it uses fragment manager begin transaction, right? And then it replaces whatever the content of it with the details fragment, right? So don't worry about this if else thing. It's you don't need it really here, right? So that is if you want to further customize it, so just keep it like that. So then you commit, you set the transaction and commit it. So that is how you dynamically load this yellow color fragment, right? Awesome, right? Okay, awesome. So that is how it loads this yellow color fragment, the second fragment, hand in hand, one after the other. But on portrait it doesn't load it. Why? Because when it's loading the titles fragment, it's checking whether it's having that, where is it, details frame, where is it, the details frame layout, right? It has it only on the landscape mode, not on the portrait. So so if you are running it on a portrait mode, that means if you run it on a device on this orientation, what happens? So when you're running it here, why the yellow color fragment is not seen is because, see, on the titles fragment, when you check it, right, it will be null because there is no frame layout when it's a portrait mode called details. So after you get it, if it's not equal to null, only uh, it it puts a value for the dual pane because it's an AND operator. So if it's not equal to null, and if it's visible only, this will be true. But now because it's null, this will not be true. So the dual pane will be false because there's no details frame layout. Because of that, the dual pane is false. Because of that, this if condition will not get executed. Because it's not getting executed, it will not show the details. So if it's not showing the details, then what happens? It's not executing this, so that it's not creating the detail fragment. That is why it's not creating the detail fragment here, right? But when you click on this button, that means on click. So when you click on this on click, right, on list click, again you show the details. So when you click on the item, that time it calls a show details, right? That time it didn't get called earlier, but when you click it calls. That is why when you click it shows the details, right? So when it shows the details, it's checking whether if it's dual pane. It's not dual pane in this mode, right? Because of that, it will go to the else. It will go to the else and it creates a new intent and it creates a new activity. See, details activity. That is why we have this details activity, right? To support the details fragment. Anyhow, so it creates a details activity and it starts the details activity. But this does not happen on the landscape mode, right? It happens only on the portrait mode. So so then it creates a details activity. So then it loads the details activity and it's checking whether it's on landscape, because if it's landscape it should not work. It should work only on portrait. So it's just cross checking. The details activity is just cross checking whether it's in landscape mode. If so, it immediately returns. It's not doing anything. It returns. But if it's not landscape, it will not go into this. So it will come here, right? And then what it does is it just creates a details fragment and adds it to the fragment manager. And that is how that is how that is how when you click here on the phone, right? Once again, that is how when you click here on the phone, it displays the details fragment. Whereas on the landscape mode, when you click, what happens? So on the landscape mode, on the titles fragment, when you click, once again it shows show details. Once again it comes here. It checks if it's dual pane. Yes, it is dual pane. Because of that, it will not go to the else and it will not create a new activity, because it's not going to else now. It's not going here. Instead of that, because it is dual pane, right? It creates a details fragment and it just adds it to the details frame element, which is the details frame layout. So that is how when you click here, right? When you click here, it loads in the yellow color the fragment in the hand in hand in front of it, right? That is how it works actually, right? Okay, so this was a detailed explanation of how this system, how this app works, and you got a clear idea of doing something like this, right? Awesome, great. Okay, so we did a practical demonstration for this lesson, and the conclusion is we continued on from the previous example and we further explained the code for you to have a clear understanding. And the example was we used two fragments to create a two pane layout. So two pane layout meaning two panes. So if you have more space on a landscape orientation, you can show both the panes at the same time. But if you have less space on a portrait orientation, you will show only one at a time. So we discuss how to do it. You can find the code to download the link, and also to show you both in the handset and on the larger tab. On the portrait orientation, it does not show both of the fragments at the same. It's not showing, right? So it shows them only if you have it on landscape mode like this. Same here, only if it's on the landscape mode. So this is how you deal with portrait and landscape scenarios. Awesome, right? So you learn about that. So you can find the link to download the source code in the description section. And we used the Apple developer docs and APIs for references, and it was a very successful lesson on fragments. And you learn a lot about fragments, about dynamically dealing with fragments and different orientations, and especially you learn about using fragments to modularize, and especially how you use fragments when you have larger screens. So have a look at the next part of this lecture series about fragments and activities. Look at the next lesson also for you to further improve your understanding about activities and fragments, and also have a look at our other videos. So we are very excited to see you in our next video, which we discuss more about activities and fragments. See you in our next lesson. See you until that.